Chapter 9. There were no answers to be found in Portelath. The three companions went through the village and found the same signs of sudden departure that they had seen at the border post. There was evidence of some hasty packing, but in the majority of the houses most of the occupants' possessions were still in place. Everything spoke of a population that had departed in a hurry, taking what they could carry on their backs and little more. Tools, utensils, clothes, furniture, and other personal goods had been left behind, but they could find no clue as to where the people of Portelath had gone, or why they had departed. As full night closed in, Gillen finally called an end to their search. They returned to the Riata's house, where they unsaddled the horses and rubbed them down in the shelter of a small porch at the front of the building. They spent an uneasy night in the house. At least Will did, and he assumed Horace was as uncomfortable as he was. Gillen, for his part, seemed relatively unperturbed, rolling himself into his cloak and falling instantly asleep when Will relieved him after the first watch. But Gillen's manner was more subdued than normal, and Will guessed that the ranger was more concerned by this baffling turn of events than he was letting on. As he stood his watch, Will was amazed at how much noise a house could make. Doors creaked, floors groaned, the ceiling seemed to sigh with every breath of wind outside, and the village itself seemed full of loose items that would bang and clatter as well, bringing Will to a nervous, wide-eyed attention as he sat by the unglazed window in the front room of the house, the wooden shutters hooked back to keep them secure. The moon seemed keen to join in on the subterfuge as well, soaring high above the village and casting deep pools of shadow between the houses of the village. Shadows that seemed to move slightly when you caught sight of them out of the corner of your eye, then stopped as soon as you stared directly at them. More movement came as clouds flew across the face of the moon, alternately causing the main square to be illuminated, then plunged into sudden darkness. Just after midnight, as Gillen had predicted, a steady rain set in, and the other noises were joined by the gurgle of running water and the plash, plash, plash of drops falling off eaves and into puddles below. Will woke Horace to take over the watch at around 2 in the morning. He piled up a stack of cushions and bed covers on the floor of the main room, wrapped his cloak around him, and lay down. Then he lay awake for another hour and a half, listening to the creaks, the groans, the gurgles, and the splashes, wondering whether Horace had dropped off to sleep, and whether, even now, some unseen horror was creeping up on the house, bloodthirsty and unstoppable. He was still worrying about it when he finally fell asleep, without noticing that he had done so. They were on the road early the following morning. The rain had stopped just before dawn, and Gillen was keen to press on to Gwyntalith, the first large town on their route, and find some answers to the puzzles that they had found so far in Celtica. They had a quick, cold breakfast of hard bread and dried fruit washed down with icy water from the village well, then saddled up and rode out. They wound down the stony path from the village, taking their time on the uneven surface, but when they hit the main road once more, they urged their horses into a canter. They held the canter for 20 minutes, then rested the horses by walking for the next 20. They maintained that alternating pattern through the morning, and the miles went by steadily. They ate a quick meal in the middle of the day, then rode on. This was the principal mining area of Celtica, and they passed at least a dozen coal or iron mines, large black holes cut into the sides of hills and mountains, surrounded by timber shoring and stone buildings. Nowhere, however, did they see any sign of life. It was as if the inhabitants of Celtica had simply vanished from the face of the earth. "They may have deserted the border post, or even the villages," Gillen muttered once, almost to himself. "But I've never yet met a Celt who would desert a mine while there is still an ounce of metal still to be torn from it." Eventually, in mid-afternoon, they came over the crest, and there, in a valley dropping away from them, were the neat rows of stone roofs that formed Gwyntalith Township. A small spire in the center of the town marked a temple. The Celts had their own unique religion, which had to do with the gods of fire and iron. A larger tower formed the main defensive position for the town. They were too far away to make out whether there might be any movement of people in the streets. But as before, there was no sign of smoke from the chimneys, and even more significantly, according to Gillen, no noise. "Noise?" Horace asked. "What kind of noise?" "Banging, hammering, clanking," Gillen answered him briefly. Remember, the Celts don't just mine iron ore. They also work the iron as well. With the breeze blowing from the southwest as it is, we should be able to hear the forges at work, even from this distance. Well, let's go see then, Will said, and began to urge Tug forward. Gillen, however, put up a hand to restrain him. I think perhaps I might go on ahead alone, he said slowly, his eyes never leaving the town in the valley below him. Will looked at him puzzled. Alone? He asked, and Gillen nodded. You noted yesterday that we were making ourselves pretty obvious when we rode into Portelleth, and you are right. Perhaps it's time to become a little more circumspect. Something's going on, and I'd like to know what it is. Will had to agree that it made good sense for Gillen to go on alone. After all, he was probably the best unseen mover in the Ranger Corps, and Rangers were the best unseen movers in the kingdom. Gillen motioned for them to fall back from the crest where they were standing on, and down the other side to a spot where a small gully formed a sheltered campsite out of the wind. Set up camp here, he told them. No fires. We'll have to stay with cold rations until we know what's going on. I should be back some time after dark. And with that, he wheeled Blaze and trotted him back over the crest and down the road toward Gwyntalith. Will and Horace took half an hour or so to set up the campsite. There was little to do. They attached their tarpaulin to some scrubby bushes growing out of the stone wall of the gully, weighing down the other end with rocks. At least there were plenty of them. This gave them a triangular shelter in case the rain set in again. Then they prepared a fireplace in front of the shelter. Gillen had said no fires, but if he arrived back in the middle of the night and changed those orders, they might as well be ready. It took a considerably longer time to stack a supply of firewood. The only real source was the scrubby heather that covered the hillsides. The roots and branches of the bush were tough but highly flammable. The two boys hacked out a reasonable supply, Horace using the small hatchet he carried in his pack, and Will his sax knife. Eventually, with all their housekeeping taken care of, they sat on either side of the empty fireplace, backs leaned against rocks. Will spent a few minutes running a sharpening stone over the sax knife, restoring the razor-sharp edge. I really prefer camping in forest areas, Horace said, shifting his back for the 10th time against the unyielding rock behind him. Will grunted in reply, but Horace was bored and kept on talking, more for the sake of having something to do than because he really wanted to. After all, in a forest you have lots of firewood ready at hand. It just falls out of the trees for you. Not while you wait, Will disagreed. He, too, was talking more for the sake of it than anything else. No, not while you wait. Usually it's already happened before you arrive, Horace said. Plus, in a forest, you've usually got pine needles or leaves on the ground, and that makes for softer sleeping places. And there are logs and trees to sit on and lean against, and they have a lot fewer sharp edges than rock. Again he wriggled his back to a temporarily more comfortable spot. He glanced up at Will, rather hoping that the apprentice ranger might disagree with him. Then they could argue to pass the time. Will, however, merely grunted again. He inspected the edge of his sax knife, slid the knife into its scabbard, and lay back. Uncomfortable, he sat up again, undid the knife belt, and draped it over his pack, along with his bow and quiver. Then he lay back, his head on the flat piece of stone. He closed his eyes. The sleepless night he had spent left him drained and flat. Horace sighed to himself, then took out his sword and began honing its edge, quite unnecessarily, as it was already razor-sharp. But it was something to do. He rasped away, glancing occasionally at Will to see if his friend was asleep. For a moment he thought he was, but then the smaller boy suddenly squirmed around, sat up, reached for his cloak. Bundling it up, he put it on the flat stone he was using as a headrest, then lay back again. "You're right about forests," he said crankily. "Much more comfortable places to camp." Horace said nothing. He decided his sword was sharp enough and slid it back into its oiled leather scabbard, leaning the sheathed weapon against the rock face behind him. He watched Will again as he tried to find a comfortable spot. No matter how he twisted and squirmed, there was always a pebble or piece of rock poking into his back or side. 5 or 10 minutes passed. Then Horace finally said, "Want to practice? It'll pass the time." Will opened his eyes and considered the idea. Reluctantly, he admitted to himself that he was never going to get to sleep on this hard, stony ground. Why not? He rummaged in his pack for his practice weapons, then joined Horace on the far side of the tent, where he was scraping a practice circle on the sandy gully floor. The two boys took up their positions. Then, at a nod from Horace, they began. Will was improving, but Horace was definitely the master at this exercise. Will couldn't help admiring the speed and balance he showed as he wielded the long stick in a dazzling series of backhands, forehands, side cuts, and overheads. Furthermore, when he knew he had beaten Will's defensive posture, he would, at the last moment, hold back from whacking him. Instead, he would lightly touch the spot where his blow would have fallen to demonstrate the point. He didn't do it with any sense of superiority either. Weapons practice, even with wooden weapons, was a serious part of Horace's life nowadays. It wasn't something to crow about when you were better than your opponent. Horace had learned only too well in dozens of practice bouts at the battle school that it never paid to underestimate an opponent. Instead, he used his superior ability to help Will, showing him how to anticipate strokes, teaching him the basic combinations that all swordsmen used and the best way to defeat them. As Will ruefully acknowledged, knowing how to do it was one thing. Actually doing it was an entirely different matter. He realized how much his former enemy had matured and wondered if the same changes were evident in himself. He didn't think so. He didn't feel any different. And whenever he saw himself in a mirror, he didn't seem to look any different either. Your left hand is dropping too far, Horace pointed out as they paused between bouts. I know, Will said. I'm expecting a side cut and I want to be ready for it. Horace shook his head. Well, that's all very well, but if you drop too far, it's easier for me to feint a side cut than swing up to an overhand. See? He showed Will the action he was describing, beginning the sword in a wide sideways sweep, then with a powerful wrist movement, taking it up into a high swinging downward stroke. He stopped the wooden blade a few inches from Will's head, and the ranger apprentice saw that his counterstroke would have been far too late. Sometimes I think I'll never learn these things, he said. Horace patted him encouragingly on the shoulder. Are you kidding? He asked. You're improving every day. And besides, I can never shoot or use those throwing knives the way you do. Even while they had been on the road, Gillen had insisted that Will practice his ranger skills as often as was practical. Horace had been impressed, to say the least, when he had seen how adept the smaller boy had become. Several times he shuddered when he thought of what might happen if he had to face an archer such as Will. His accuracy with the bow was uncanny, as far as Horace was concerned. He knew that Will could place arrows into every gap in his armor if he chose, even into the narrow visor slit of a full-faced jousting helmet. What he didn't appreciate was that Will's accuracy was nothing more than average as far as ranger standards were concerned. Let's try again, Will suggested wearily, but another voice interrupted them. Let's not, little boys. Let's put down our nasty sharp sticks and stand very still, shall us? The two apprentices whirled around at the words. There, at the mouth of the small U-shaped gully where they had built their camp, stood two ragged-looking figures. Both were heavily bearded and unkempt, and both were dressed in a strange mixture of clothing, some of it tattered and threadbare, while some items were new and obviously very costly. The taller of the two wore a richly brocaded satin vest, but it was thick with dirt. The other sported a scarlet hat with a bedraggled feather in it. He also carried an iron-spiked wooden club, holding it in a hand that was swathed in a dirty bandage. His companion had a long, jagged sword that was nicked along the edges. He flourished it now at the two boys. Come on now, you boys. Sharp sticks is dangerous for the likes of you, he said, and let go a hoarse, guttural laugh. Will's hand dropped automatically to reach for the sax knife but he encountered nothing. With a sinking feeling he realized that his knife belt, bow, and quiver were all neatly piled on the far side of the fireplace where he had been sitting. The two intruders would stop him before he could reach them. He cursed himself for his carelessness. Halt would be furious, he thought. Then, looking at the sword and the club, he realized that Halt's annoyance might just be the least of his worries.